Israel remain locked in conflict. President Obama calling on Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu for an immediate ceasefire. While Mr. Obama repeated his support for Israel, there's growing criticism now of the White House and of Secretary of State John Kerry. Some say the ceasefire proposals favor Hamas too much. Joining me now, Julie Roginski, Fox News contributor and former political advisor to Senator Frank Lautenberg, and David Avella, president of GOPAC. Julie, where do you fall on this?
Well, you know, I'd be a hypocrite if I were to blame President Bush 10 years ago or 15 years ago for dictating to Israel what they should do with Gaza, and I'd be the same hypocrite if I were to not criticize Barack Obama today. Look, the Israelis did not start this. They are under siege. To have a ceasefire for Hamas only benefits Hamas today because all of a sudden Hamas would have a chance to rearm, it'd have a chance to catch its breath, and continue to fire rockets at Israel. Meanwhile, the Israelis have lived under siege since 1948, since their existence, and Hamas has not come into being until more recently, but continues to try to attempt Israel's annihilation. If Mexico or Canada were to fire rockets into our country, I can only imagine the reaction our country would have. For us to dictate to the Israelis is unacceptable.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, aside from that, not to mix apples and oranges, but Mexico did fire on the border agents about a month ago, and nothing did apparently happen. But let's stick to Israel and Gaza and Hamas right now, David. So what do you think Secretary Kerry and President Obama need to do now?
It's hard to imagine that the president's trying to line up with the only three allies that Hamas has in this fight, which is the New York Times, CNN, and MSNBC. And that what the president ought to be doing is sending John Kerry to a kibbutz, like I went last year, and spend some time with Israelis who live every day with missiles being potentially fired into their village. And in fact, the kibbutz I was in on July the 11th of this year did get bombed with missiles. And you see the anguish, you see the stress that's on those mothers' faces as they think every time an alarm sounds, they've got 60 seconds to get their kids into shelter.
Okay, so Julie, what's the difference about this fight? I mean, now that we're dealing with Hamas, right? I mean, for the general public who's watching this, who may think that it's the Palestinian people being represented by Hamas, you say what?
Well, first of all, Hamas is harming the Palestinian people more than Israel ever could. Hamas, instead of investing in hospitals and schools, is investing the money that they have into building tunnels to smuggle arms and terrorists into Israel. So the people that I do feel bad for are the Palestinian people. They're living at the mercy of this terrorist organization more than anybody else, even the Israelis. And so don't confuse the Palestinian people with the actions of Hamas. Secondly, you know, the problem with Hamas and the problem with what the Palestinians are going through is they have been misled by their leadership and by their supposed regional allies since 1948. And so for anybody to say that the Hamas is on the side of the Palestinians, that Yasser Arafat back in the day was on the side of the Palestinians, that Egypt, Jordan, even allies like Egypt and Jordan, American allies, Syria, Iran, that these people since 1948 were on the side of the Palestinian people, they've done more to harm the Palestinian people than anybody ever could.
All right, so Secretary Kerry still going to try to iron something out here. I'm not exactly sure what at this time, but the president, David, the president is asking Israel for a ceasefire. So how should they respond?
The president should revoke John Kerry's passport and stay out of this. That the president ought to allow the Israelis to do what they need to do to defend themselves. And I think Julie made an outstanding point. The ones who are really getting hurt here, beyond the Israeli families, is the Palestinian families. And just as a mother in Israel should allow her child to grow up, so should a Palestinian mother. And the only way that happens is if they, too, take on Hamas and take on these terror organizations are doing more to hurt their future than Israel is.
David, Julie, thanks for the insights.
Thank you.
Well, another Fox News alert now. Back home, a recycling